Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And on this series, Theory Crafting, I take a look at civilizations and units not yet present in Age of Empires 2, one of my favorite games of all time, and take my best shot at designing a reasonable framework for how they might look if they were to appear in-game someday. On this episode, we are taking a look at a unit, or rather a pair of units, along with a more large-scale overhaul of one of the most neglected unit types in the game, that being the infantrymen. Yes, the humble infantrymen, the backbone of almost every army the world has ever known, representing in many cases over 90% of the head count of a battlefield, and yet in Age of Empires 2, they are doo-doo. Well, hopefully this video will give some options that will make them much less suck than they have been traditionally. And what better way to kick off this comprehensive infantry overhaul, likely spanning multiple episodes, than with the Swordsman and Greatswordsman, a subdivision of the current militia line. Yes, indeed, the current militia line is unequivocally ass. Pretty much only ever seen because of early rush stuff done by high micro tryhards who would obviously stomp me into the dirt, but it has very little purpose in late and particularly mid-game play, and this build seeks to address that by making the two lines more historical, interesting, and varied in how they play strategically in-game. As always, if you want any disclaimers as to my process with these builds, or you want any insights as to my philosophy in approaching this theory crafting series more broadly, please take a look on screen right now. And bear in mind, as always, that a link to a comprehensive unit document with all of my sources is linked down in the description below. Take a look at it if you wish. A note, though, that I don't have nearly as good sourcing as I would like to on this build. As with many medievalists, I have learned a lot about warfare and swords and all manner of things throughout the ages, and it's often hard for me to exactly source where I get certain ideas from, and as such, if you see any misconceptions and have some sources that can help direct me more precisely to the truth, please let me know down in the comments section. Let's move on to a preamble before we begin. What is the problem with infantry? Why do they suck so much balls? We could summarize this as them being overcosted and underperforming and too slow and too weak and whatever, but I wanted to look at this on a more systematic level. In an RTS, all units need to be able to force engagements. That means make the opponent fight you when you are in a favorable situation. And all of the unit classes in-game do this in a different and unique way, although of course to different degrees. Archers have range. They can shoot you from a distance and make you either fight them or run. Cavalry have speed. They can chase you down and make you fight them. Good luck running. Siege can threaten your base, forcing your opponent to either get rid of the siege or sacrifice a portion of their valuable infrastructure. But what can infantry do? I mean, they kind of threaten the base, in certain situations at least, but not very well, not nearly as well as siege does, more broadly speaking. And because of this, the only infantry that really succeed in Age of Empires are stat sticks that just have very, very good stats for the cost and trade well in fights regardless of their other limitations. Yes, some infantry have range, some have speed, plenty can threaten the base, but none of them do it nearly as well, nor do they, as a unit type, have their own unique identity therein. As such, we need to look for a unique way to give infantry more broadly a way to force engagements from a systematic design point of view at the very least. And my proposal for this is, how about numbers? I mean, historically, infantry were incredibly numerous. Even civilizations that we typically think of as being cavalry or archer civilizations were overwhelmingly populated by infantrymen. Take a look at many Turco-Mongolic steppe peoples. We think of them as being these famous horse nomads, which they obviously were, but they had massive infantry corps. Well over half their army was made up of infantrymen, and they wouldn't be doing this if infantrymen were useless idiots who you just throw in there and let get killed. And so because of this, the unifying line I'd like to draw through infantry is that they were numerous. They were densely packed in these massive formations that were really, really tough to crack. And so because of them having overwhelming numbers, infantry will be able to force engagements by controlling space. There are so many of them that it's hard to hide. You can just surround your opponent and gradually advance in. And so because of this, infantry should stay overall relatively slow, but they should still be fairly tough, especially for their price, which should be lower. They should be cheaper and quicker to train overall to represent how easy it was to muster a very large force of infantrymen. And even when your army wasn't known for infantry, you'd still have plenty of them. With this analysis in mind, my stated goals for this build are to add variety and historicity to the game more broadly and infantry civs more specifically, while also at least beginning to address this general topic of infantry forcing engagements through numbers. Now, I should note that the swordsmen and greatswordsmen that I'll be getting into aren't necessarily specialists within this field, but I will also be talking about a number of proposed technologies I have to add to the barracks more broadly that will definitely strike at this greater theme, with the swordsmen and greatswordsmen being slightly offbeat variations thereof, though still, generally speaking, playing in to this overarching infantry strategy. With that said, let's move on to Section A, the Swordsman line. If you're new here, please make sure to like and subscribe. The channel is doing so fantastically well these days, and I'd love to have you guys along for the ride. With that said, let's move on to an overview of the Swordsman line. It progresses as such. The sellsword in Dark Age, the footmen in Feudal Age, the solidarios in Castle Age, and the sergeant in Imperial Age. Let us begin with an analysis of main hand swords in warfare. The sword and shield. I don't think there is any more recognizable symbol of medieval warfare than the sword and shield put together. But is it anything more than a symbol? Depends on where you're looking. In European battlefields, particularly in the Middle and late Middle Ages, sword and shield warriors were not common. That doesn't mean they didn't exist, but broadly speaking, they were uncommon. The sword is obviously a very useful sidearm, but it is, of course, also quite expensive to make. That isn't to say that sword and shield type warriors were never existent in Europe. They were actually quite common, particularly in late antiquity, which we see represented a little bit in Age of Empires, and even the early Middle Ages among the Vikings, Franks, and similar. But even then, it was pretty much never, from what I could tell, the backbone of a European army, almost always fulfilling the role of an auxiliary troop type. Great for things like raiding enemy bases or flanking enemies mid-battle and doing like smaller scale skirmishes, where one-on-one dueling was much more of a big deal than fighting in tight pack formation with a couple hundred of your best friends. The sword and shield offers a lot of flexibility, and such troops were often quite fast and more capable of operating independently. But Europe isn't the end of the story. Sword and shield type warriors were very prominent in other parts of the world. Asia, the Middle East, Mesoamerica, all of these cultures had sword and shield type soldiers that made substantial impacts and likely saw a lot more use in battlefield combat than we see in Europe. Though again, even there, it's probably not the backbone of an army. It is incredibly hard to find sources about this particular topic in general, so if you guys know anything else about where the sword and shield was used out in the broader world, I would love to hear from you down in the comments section. But one thing's for certain, and that's that the sword and shield was much less common on a medieval battlefield than we see typically depicted. As always, if you want to see any of the details on this particular unit, make sure to check out the unit document in the description for all the details. And speaking of those details, let's go into the stats for the swordsman line. They would be largely comparable to the current sword line, but only costing 50 food and 15 gold. That's substantially cheaper. And more importantly, they would grow into having better speed and pierce armor than the current sword line, as well as having an explicit attack bonus versus levies, that being units that don't cost gold. We all know the sword line as being a very reliable trash killer in late game, and the swordsman line, because of this bonus, will be an incredibly effective trash killer, pretty much its stated goal. Now, earlier in the game, the sword line will actually have better attack than an existing militiaman, but they'll have slower train time and need to be installed. You need to spend 75 food, 50 gold, and wait for a tech timer to elapse before you can even train the sellsword in Dark Age. And this should make it such that even though the sellsword will be more dangerous than a militia is currently, not to mention cheaper, it will be harder to get to and much harder to time those perfect early game rushes that so dominate today's meta. Still possible, still very impactful, but less obvious. I really don't like how default that strategy has become, and as such these changes are meant to add more diversity to early game play at the highest levels. Now, Later on, once you hit the Sergeant in Imperial Age, you're going to be seeing worse attack and HP than the current sword line, but they will still have good deal better train time and total upgrade cost, as well as the other perks earlier. They are going to be fulfilling the auxiliary role that sword and shield type units seem to have had on most medieval battlefields, namely blitzers, raiders, and flankers, charging out there to wipe up enemy trash, but pulling back before they can be absolutely ripped to shreds by heavier enemy units, not to mention being a little bit better against enemy archers to allow them to flank around the sidelines, and still retaining a good amount of bonus damage against things like buildings, allowing them to chew through an enemy base if your opponent is foolish enough to let a 40 stack of them in. Of note, my own footman build will need to be renamed because of this. I have a full plan for this that I'll be getting into in a future recraft video. Not to mention the Sicilian unique unit will need to be changed from the Sergeant, but I personally think that is a good thing because the Sicilians are an absolute mess, and I hope to address them further in future videos. So to summarize my take on the Swordsman line, I'm looking for an improved militia line that does many of the same things, but overall better and more interestingly. So they're less automatic early in the game. The Drush will be less of the go-to option, but still quite useful since they are stronger and cheaper. However, in mid-game, I think that my version of the sword line will be far more effective than what we see currently in the game. They're a lot more viable versus crossbows and in raiding enemy bases, but they're definitely not going to be able to hold up to things like enemy knights, and a full stack of crossbows will still absolutely murder them. They'll just be incrementally better and not completely left in the dust by these other strong power units. And late game, they're going to retain a very strong role against trash, being notably more effective than the champions we see today, while also being a little more durable to arrow fire and being quicker to maneuver. As a final note on this particular unit, I'd like to introduce a regional upgrade for the Swordsman line, that being the Rodolero. This would be a unique replacement to the Sergeant upgrade, available to Iberian and Italian civilizations more broadly, much like the Winged Hussar replaces the Hussar for the Poles and Lithuanians. The Rodolero is less tanky than a Sergeant, but is notably faster and does more damage, as well as having a huge attack bonus versus gunpowders and the spear line specifically. This makes the Rodolero a replacement for what we now see as the Condottiero, as well as making it available to more civilizations. I find the Condottiero to be an incredibly lazy, stupid unit, and the Rodolero has much more historical justification for being good against gunpowder than the Condo does, while also having other utility by being very good against spears. Historically, the Rodolero was a typically Spanish unit that was later adopted in Italy that was used to break enemy pike and shot formations, an incredibly popular formation of long pikes and arquebuses used during the beginning of the Gunpowder Age, and while they weren't in service for very long, they did have enough of an impact on medieval battlefields to be adopted all across the Iberian and Italian peninsulas. Some fun flavor and a great late game option for those civilizations. Let's move on to Section B, the Great Swordsman, covering the two-handed side of our current sword line. Once again, if you would consider subscribing, that would mean an awful lot to me. I hope you're enjoying the video thus far. Let's jump in to the Great Swordsman at a glance. The base unit, the War Swordsman, will become available in the Castle Age at the barracks and can be upgraded to the Great Swordsman in the Imperial Age. They could use the current in-game models for the two-hander and champion perfectly reasonably. Though I should note that, like some common units like the Siege Onager, the Great Swordsman would be somewhat exclusive. Not tons of civilizations would have access to this powerful option. Now, when we look at the two-handed sword in warfare, we mostly think of the later Middle Ages, where you would see, for example, German Doppelsoldners wielding these massive two-handed swords effectively as polearms to break enemy pike formations and smash lightly armored front lines. But this is likely overstated, though it is iconic enough that I do reference it to some degree in this particular build. But that being said, the two-handed sword was very present in many other parts of the world. Once again, it was all over Asia, as well as being present in the Middle East and even Mesoamerica. Yes, there are two-handed versions of the famous razor obsidian club sword, the makuito. And in Asia, while you might think of the Japanese, the Chinese also used massive two-handed swords primarily as an anti-cavalry weapon. Once again, showing how this weapon was kind of half polearm and half traditional blade. But pretty much no matter where you look, great swords were pretty much always used as shock infantry, rushing the front line in just meant to do as much damage, cause as much chaos, and ideally rout the enemy before they themselves went down. My version of the Great Sword line is also fairly similar to the current sword line, using it as a baseline for its stats, but it has much better attack, as well as having forward blast damage, dealing a whopping 50% of its attack to all enemies within a 180-degree arc in front of the unit with every single swing. It also has a little bit of range to its attack, 0.33 of a tile, which doesn't seem like much, but will mean it always gets the first strike and can even cheekily swing past enemies that would otherwise cause pathing problems. That being said, it has a relatively low rate of fire, meaning that despite its massive damage, it can become out-traded if a fight lasts too long. They also have a little bit of melee armor, but 0 pierce armor, meaning that they are notably susceptible to enemy ranged units if they can't jump on them quickly. And since these units are slower than the Swordsman line, it's a lot less likely they'll be able to catch up to enemy archers. Lastly, the Greatsword line has a big attack bonus versus unshielded enemy units. This would be a new classification that you could assign to different units, specifically infantry, cavalry, and archers, not siege, villagers, ships, anything else. If that unit had a shield in its model, it would count as shielded, and vice versa. And because of this strength against unshielded units, the Great Swordsman is a fairly interestingly niche counter against a variety of different enemy unit types. Spears, it will eat for breakfast. Light cavalry, it will eat for breakfast. They aren't holding the shield, so it doesn't count. Whereas something like a skirm, it might not trade as cost effectively against as you might think. Because of this, the sword line will also likely trade favorably with the Great Swordsman despite their massive area of effect, though it won't be a perfect trade by any means. So what this all boils down to is that the Greatsword is a line breaker unit. It can absolutely slaughter anything if its path, if it gets close enough, but not only does it die hard to range, but it can be kind of tricky to keep them alive long enough for them to have the sort of damage impact you want them to before going down swinging. As with before, check the unit doc down below if you want any more details on this particular side of the build. Let's round it off with Section C, the Infantry Techs more broadly. Much like with my religious build, I propose a litany of different technologies to add to the barracks, and I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on them. Speaking of which, what do you think about subscribing? Maybe a cool idea? Okay, I'll stop begging. Oh, and make sure that you join the Discord if you have any interest in doing so. That is linked down in the description below. We've been having a lot of fun open forums recently, and if you have any interest, I would love to have you participate in one. Let's jump into my technology offerings. Of note, none of these technologies are mandatory for this build. They are rather a variety of offerings that I think could be comprehensively looked at in order to buff infantry in a variety of different ways, both from historical variety and power perspectives. And as such, I'm going to be assigning individual likeliniometers to each one of them in turn at the end of this particular section. Let's jump into some feudal age offerings, beginning with enarmes. Now, what are enarmes? They are the little straps on a shield that let you hold it more effectively, and it allows a shield to be used with a lot more versatility. The enarmes technology would cost 50 food and 100 wood, quite cheap, and it would be a gambeson replacement. Shielded infantry get 1 more pierce armor. Once again, I'm using the shielded tag here, which right now would apply to the sword line as well as my footman line, to be renamed in a future recraft. It is just a better version of gambesons. Why did I do this? I think gambesons is poo-poo, mostly from a historical perspective, because gambesons being padded cloth armor not only would not just apply to swordsmen, but they were also very effective and should give at the very least +1/+1 armor rather than only focusing on pierce. Enarmes, on the other hand, were specifically a shield-oriented technology that makes much more sense for being specialized against incoming projectile attacks. Not to mention the fact that gambesons can only be acquired in Castle Age really limits its utility against a fast archer rush or early Castle Age crossbow play. Moving on, quartering. This would be another feudal age technology costing 125 food and 75 gold, and would make all infantry cost -20% food. It's just supplies, but renamed in order to be more historically accurate, and also broadened to become much more impactful. It doesn't have quite as much impact on the sword line per se, but they're already cheaper. And as such, this would be a Bloodlines-esque cornerstone early game technology that could be hugely impactful for a civilization's infantry viability. Quartering refers to the practice of putting up soldiers in local civilians' homes so you don't have to bring along tents, and so that they can be fed by your local populace instead of dipping into your valuable supply train. A much more fitting name than the very boring and dull supplies. On to the Castle Age, beginning with marching drills. 225 food only. This would give all infantry plus 10% speed. So is it just squires? No! It would also make it so that while infantry are both undamaged for 10 seconds and unmoving, they will start to regenerate 10 hit points per minute. A small amount for sure, but enough to add up over time, especially if you have a lot of infantry. While obviously it is a replacement for squires, because squires are a stupid name for a technology that benefits only infantry, given that squires were meant to attend knights, the majority of whom would likely have been mounted. It is also very in theme, in my opinion, for infantry to all have some sort of HP regen mechanic. Infantry are an endurance-based troop type, wearing down your opponent with sheer body mass rather than speed and range. And as such, this technology will not only be available to a great many different civilizations, but will also help strike better at that overarching vision I had for infantry that I outlined at the beginning of the video. Nextly, shield wall. If you remember my footman video, you'll remember this one very, very well. It costs 300 wood, 150 gold, and it is an expansion of that original footman build technology. Yet another reason for me to update that video. It was the first unit I ever made, and my design philosophies have shifted since I first created it. To summarize for those who don't know it, while unmoving, shielded infantry, namely the footmen, the swordsman, and likely other units that I will get to in future, are immune to arrow and javelin fire. Completely immune. It's obviously incredible versus archers, but it's also really good for doing creeping advances towards enemy static defenses. Where it won't help is versus siege weapons, alternative ranged projectiles, as well as things like war galleys. Galleys I'd qualify as an arrow, war galleys look more like a ballista bolt. Shield wall, I think, is going to be an incredibly important technology, though it is very strategically defining. It's not going to be something that every player is going to want to use on a game-to-game basis, but I can see many civilizations, particularly infantry-focused civilizations, making fantastic use of it. And yeah, that old footman build of mine definitely needs a few updates. Let's move on to some final infantry technologies, both of them Imperial Age. The first one, muster rolls. If you've ever played Age of Empires 1, you might know where I'm going with this one. Muster rolls cost 200 wood, 400 gold, and it makes so that all infantry take half population space, and all barracks cost minus 75 wood. Wow, that sounds really, really scary. It obviously will really help with late game infantry spam, particularly since you can put down barracks so much quicker, but it's also really good for tech switching, allowing you to quickly pivot into, for example, halberdiers to support your arbalests late game, and allowing infantry to not burden your army as much because of their relative lack of population efficiency. You might say that this would be broken. I don't think so. We have lived in an archer and cavalry dominated meta for so long that a technology like this seems like not even enough to make infantry viable since it's gated towards late game. It will, however, make infantry very, very good in late game if you can pick it up and really start to get your infantry churn going. Second Imperial Age technology is retrobanum. This is effectively a term for mass conscription, an edict issued that would levy a great number of soldiers, typically as foot soldiers, all at once. It would be an expensive technology costing 400 food and 600 gold, and would make all infantry have minus 33% training time, and barracks techs have minus 33% research time. It's mini perfusion. Yes! That is very, very strong. Perfusion is obviously a disgustingly good technology. But guess what? Even with perfusion, the gods get stomped in late game all the frickin' time. And I would argue the Huskarl and their infantry cost reduction are almost as impactful to their success as perfusion is on them. And retrobanum is a good deal weaker. It will still be a massive capstone infantry power boost tech that will allow for late game infantry spam to become very viable as a strategy, and when combined with muster rolls, will allow your infantry to blot out the map as the ultimate fulfillment of their strategy as a unit class that I outlined earlier, forcing engagements through sheer numbers. To quickly go through the likeliness for each of these technologies and terms, in noms I call a 3 out of 10. I could see Gambeson's being renamed because it is kind of dumb from a historical perspective and is a very easy change to make. Quartering, I gave a 2.5 out of 10. Even if the effect itself wasn't implemented, it's certainly a much better name than supplies and wouldn't be hard to implement either. Marching drills, I call it a 1 out of 10. I could see maybe the renaming justification I gave above applying here as well, but I think it's less of a shoo-in than the other two, and the regeneration effect, I don't think that the devs will want want to tango with. Shield Wall, I give a 2.5 out of 10. That's probably optimistic, but it would be such a good way to give infantry a little more love, even if you didn't take it nearly as far as I did. Muster Rolls, I give a 4 out of 10. If the devs were to listen to the community and actually try to fix infantry, I think that porting a technology from Age of Empires 1 is probably the cleanest way to do it. And Logistics, the Age of Empires 1 tech that has the half population space effect, I think would at the very least placate a lot of community members who would really like to see infantry get a little bit more support. And lastly, Retrobanum, I give a 1.5 out of 10. The 0.5 is mostly just jokes. Yes, it would be cool. Yes, I think it would really help infantry be viable and probably elevate them to equal viability to the other two, particularly in late game. But I don't think they're going to want to go that far anytime soon. And speaking of likeliniometers, let's move on to a couple of loose threads to round out this build, beginning with my threads for the Swordsman line specifically. I'm trying to balance a bunch of different roles for the unit. Raider, Rusher, Anti-Levy, not too bad against archers, and I'm not sure my current numbers achieve that. I could see having to go through a bunch of different iterations and kind of tweaking one thing at a time to see if it can achieve this overarching strategic goal. Secondly, the train time and upgrade costs might still be a little too high. I do think that having them be installed and slow to train early on is necessary to make sure that rushes aren't absolutely dominant, but it could be that those things just kind of build up on each other to the point that the unit isn't particularly viable in late and especially mid-game, which is really where I was hoping to promote the unit's use. And lastly, the name Sellsword could feel a little weird. It is, of course, implying mercenary, which might not really match the vibe of every civilization. I was kind of going off the idea that, oh, in Dark Age, early in the game, you have to, like, pay local vagabonds to come and help you out. But if people didn't like that, we could easily rename it to the Irregular, which I think summarizes the kind of auxiliary skirmishing type thing that sword and shield-based warriors often did pretty well. Great Sword, a couple of threads for that particular unit build. Two-handed Swordsman might be a better name, particularly for the first upgrade, the War Swordsman. War swords were very big two-handed weapons, but it might be seen as a little bit awkward, especially because the term two-handed swordsman is fairly iconic to the game. I also think the current unit models might have too small swords. I haven't really measured or anything like that, but since I'm giving them a little bit of range, it might just feel like their current weapons don't really justify that extra little bit of reach. Nextly, the Great Sword having both a ranged attack and blast damage might be a little bit awkward. The blast damage would be calculated from the unit's base rather than from the point of impact, and has the same range as its actual swing, meaning that it should kind of fit the same arc more broadly, but I don't know necessarily how it would play out in practice. And lastly, I was even considering giving it negative pierce armor at base to really emphasize its susceptibility to ranged attacks. If the unit felt a little too good and was really obliterating things way too fast, that would be probably my favorite way of balancing it. Or toning down its base attack and upping its attack versus unshielded to make shielded units more of a counter to it. Lastly, some threads on my tech offerings. One, I really considered giving a zone of control mechanic to infantry, maybe through the shield wall tech. This would be like an expanded enemy-only hitbox that would make it so that enemy units could not just squeak past an infantryman without attacking it directly. I think it's a really cool idea and definitely helps the infantrymen close off the map more and kind of fulfill their creeping advance style overarching gameplay strategy. But I wasn't really sure how it would play with pathfinding, and it kept feeling a little bit awkward in my head as I was thinking about it. I do think that I might want to introduce this mechanic for my Footman line, to be renamed, when I do a more complete remake of it in my next Recraft video. Love to hear what you guys think of this particular idea. Another one, my technology quartering, might be better named billeting. Billeting means pretty much the exact same thing, but it seems like quartering has slightly more of a 17 to 1800s connotation, whereas billeting is a little bit more universal. Not really sure about this one myself. I prefer the term quartering. And lastly, some tabled ideas, specifically in the tech domain. I had the idea to scrap arson, but give all infantry baseline bonus attack versus buildings. Maybe giving marching drills more speed when you're taking a new formation, either when you hit one of the formational toggles or when your units gather together after you give them a move command. It's a tabled idea that I actually also gave in my Tibetans build, and I think a commenter on that one mentioned that there could be a serious exploit to be found, so I didn't really want to tangle with this, though I do love the mechanic. I also had the idea that Shield Wall would give you a really good dodge shield like the Srilam's Rider has instead of complete immunity, but I like the immunity more. And lastly, two technology ideas. One, formational training, giving some combination of extra attack, bonus damage, and armor when infantry are packed tightly together. I love this idea and think it really fits the overarching infantry theme quite well, but I'm thinking about introducing this one a little later down the line with a different build that I currently have in the works for the distant future. And lastly, I strongly considered a tech that would give all infantry a little bit of bonus damage versus cavalry. Why to do this? Well, if you look at kind of the unit counter triangle of Age of Empires, cavalry counter archers, archers counter infantry, infantry counter cavalry. But infantry don't really counter cavalry, or at least non-pike infantry don't really counter cavalry. And so a technology that made that a little bit more explicit, since I would say cavalry do definitely counter archers and archers definitely do counter infantry, just off of their baseline mechanical nature alone, it felt like it could be fitting. I just felt like it was a little bit shoehorned and didn't really find a good historical term that I could name the technology in a way that made it feel universal to all infantrymen. And with all that, we come to the end of this infantry unit build. Thank you guys so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed. Before we round off, we've seen a couple of likelyometers already, but let's look at the likelyometer for the units themselves. How likely do I think it is that the actual official developers would implement a change like this and subdivide the current militia line into two completely different infantry? And on the likelyometer for this build, we have a 1 out of 10. It's not going to happen. Sorry guys, I really wish I could say otherwise. The devs have shown substantial reluctance to do subdivisions, and the militia line is arguably the single most iconic unit in the entire game, so I don't think they would touch it, and will instead try to do more, in my opinion, ham-fisted changes like gambesons in order to make infantry line, specifically swordsmen, more viable. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you think. How do you like my designs, both for these units and all the technologies? Do you have any suggestions for regional variants or regional technologies that might only be available to a certain number of civilizations? Kind of like my Rodolero idea on the swordsman line. Do you think that this build, as stated, would help to make infantry more viable? Do you think it would make them overpowered even, and if so, why? And lastly, and most importantly, what else do you want to see from me on this channel going forward? Oh, and as mentioned before, make sure to jump into the Discord server linked down below if you'd like to speak to me and fellow like-minded history, Age of Empires, and theory crafting aficionados more directly. I hear my son chattering down in the kitchen below. I'm gonna have to go relieve my wife now. But with all that being said, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.